his same songs, but looking at them again, and he was so open to change. It was incredible.
From the moment she stepped into the limelight, Barbra Streisand's love life has been as captivating as her voice. She dated Hollywood's finest, found herself in messy entanglements, and kept the world guessing with her whirlwind romances. But out of all the men who passed through her life, a select few stood out, the ones she would later describe as unforgettable. So who were these men, and what exactly made them so impossible to forget for a woman like Streisand? Let's dive into the story. Elliot Gould. If there's one relationship Barbra Streisand has never managed to erase from her heart, it's her marriage to Elliot Gould. Their story began in 1961, long before she was a household name, back when two ambitious young actors crossed paths at auditions for the Broadway musical I Can Get It For You Wholesale. Gould had already been cast as the leading man, while Streisand, still new and understandably nervous, was just another hopeful performer in the room. According to Gould, she was so flustered after her audition that she scribbled her number down and handed it to practically everyone in sight. But out of all the people there that day, it was Gould who remembered and called. That call would change both their lives. Barbra not only landed the role, but also landed the man who would become her first husband. The two married in 1963, had a son together, and for a time seemed to embody the very picture of young love in a golden era. But as with many Hollywood romances, the reality wasn't nearly as perfect as it looked. By 1969, they had separated, and just 2 years later, their divorce was finalized. What really went wrong? For decades, gossip columns offered speculation, while Streisand, ever private, kept her silence. Gould, however, was more open, offering glimpses into the cracks of their union. On the surface, their relationship began like many others. Two young lovers swept away by attraction and possibility. Gould admitted years later that he was struck from the very first moment, calling Barbra so beautiful, and admitting he fell head over heels despite being shy and inexperienced with women. She became not just his co-star, but his first real love. They moved in quickly, and within 2 years they were married. But what started with excitement soon turned volatile. Gould once described their marriage as a fantastic experience, filled with sweetness, a lot of chocolate souffle, but also intense pain, comparing it to a bath of lava. Streisand herself reflected that it must have been difficult for him, confessing that when two people are deeply self-involved, marriage becomes a dangerous balancing act. And for them, the imbalance only grew wider as Barbra's career began to skyrocket. 1963 wasn't just the year Streisand tied the knot. It was also the year she released her breakthrough album, the Barbra Streisand album, which won her 2 Grammys. By 1964, she was starring as Fanny Brice in Funny Girl on Broadway, a role that would define her career and put her face on the cover of Time. Still in her early 20s, she was unstoppable. In 1968, she made the leap to Hollywood, starring in the film version of Funny Girl, and walked away with an Academy Award. From there, it was Hello, Dolly, and a string of roles that cemented her as one of the most powerful women in entertainment. Meanwhile, Elliot Gould was working steadily in both film and theater, but he couldn't keep up with his wife's meteoric rise. To the press, he became Mr. Streisand, a label he admitted he despised. He told The Independent that it was hard to be married to someone so devoted to success, especially when he felt lost in her shadow. Gould confessed that their relationship suffered because they didn't grow together. In his words, Barbra eventually became more important than us. By the early 70s, Gould's off-screen behavior was making headlines of its own. Rumors about drugs and clashes on film sets swirled. One production, A Glimpse of Tiger, even shut down after just 4 days amid rumors of fights and erratic behavior. Studios grew wary, forcing him into psychiatric evaluations before allowing him to work. Gould later brushed off the stories of drug abuse, insisting he didn't have a drug problem. He had a problem with reality. Still, the damage to his reputation had been done. At the same time, Streisand's name was being dragged through gossip columns, with writers painting her as a prima donna who clashed with directors and co-stars. She admitted it wore on her, saying she hated how her personal life and marriage became fodder for distortion. Vulnerability, she explained, wasn't something she could switch off. If she was vulnerable in her art, she was vulnerable to cruel headlines too. Behind the scenes, rumors of affairs added more fuel to the fire. Streisand was said to have shared brief but intense moments with her Funny Girl co-stars Sidney Chaplin and later Omar Sharif. The alleged flings didn't last, but they were enough to stir speculation about her devotion to Gould. At the same time, Gould was struggling with his own identity. He admitted he couldn't keep playing the role of Mr. Streisand and needed to find himself outside the confines of his marriage. Looking back, he explained that they married too young and too fast and did the best they could with the little life experience they had. By 1969, the cracks had become fractures. They separated, and by 1971, the marriage was officially over. Though the marriage ended, neither Streisand's nor Gould's story stopped there. Gould's career rebounded with critical acclaim in Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, which earned him an Oscar nomination, followed by standout roles in Robert Altman's MASH and The Long Goodbye. He went on to build a long, steady career spanning decades, from California Split to the Ocean's 11 franchise. Streisand, of course, soared to legendary status with awards, sold-out tours, and a career that defined generations. She dated high-profile men like Warren Beatty, Chris Christopherson, and even tennis star Andre Agassi before finding lasting love with actor James Brolin, whom she married in 1998. Gould remarried actress Jennifer Bogart 3 times, in fact, before eventually settling into a unique arrangement of friendship and family with her. Despite the ups and downs, Barbra and Elliot never truly cut each other out. They co-parented their son Jason with care, and over time, bitterness gave way to respect. Streisand once admitted that once you love someone, they become part of who you are forever. Gould seemed to agree, telling The Independent that he would always love her and that she remained a significant part of his life. Even today, he describes her as part of his small family unit, grateful that her husband James Brolin treats him with kindness. They may not have had a fairy tale ending, but in their own way, they carved out something just as rare. A post-divorce bond built on mutual respect, shared history, and an unshakable connection. Looking back, their marriage was both exhilarating and destructive, filled with passion, ambition, and the chaos of 2 young stars trying to navigate fame. It wasn't meant to last forever, but it left a mark that neither of them has forgotten. When Streisand looks back on the men who shaped her life, it's no surprise Elliot Gould makes the list. He wasn't just her first husband. He was her first great love, the man who knew her before the world did. And in Hollywood, where most relationships fade like old movie posters, that kind of love is truly unforgettable. John Peters. When it comes to Barbra Streisand's love life, the story has never been neat or simple. It's been dramatic, messy, and unforgettable, just like the woman herself. And if Elliot Gould was her first great love, then John Peters was the wild card who turned her world upside down. At first glance, they were an unlikely match. She was already a superstar with Grammys, Oscars, and the world at her feet. He was a hairdresser with a hustler's charm and bigger dreams than his scissors could ever cut. But fate, or maybe just a good haircut, brought them together. And what followed was nearly a decade of passion, chaos, and creation that burnt too brightly to last. The way they met was almost too cinematic to believe. Peters had bragged to people working with Streisand that he wanted to cut her hair. He didn't say it lightly either. He insisted he would go anywhere at any time for free. Streisand later joked that all he needed to say was for free to win her attention. Around the same time, Streisand was searching for a specific hairstyle for her film For Pete's Sake, 1974. At a party, she spotted a woman with the exact look she wanted and asked where she'd gotten it. The answer? John Peters. One phone call later, the deal was set. Except Streisand showed up late. An hour late. Peters, hot-tempered and impatient, was about ready to storm out when she finally arrived. And then everything shifted. He wasn't just struck by her presence. He was, in his own words, completely taken aback by her body. To him, their meeting wasn't coincidence. It was cosmic. And in that instant, their story began. They didn't just fall into romance, they became partners in every sense. Peters moved from styling hair to producing films, And Streisand wasn't just his muse. She was his equal. Together they built homes, built projects, and built dreams that most people laughed at until she proved them real. Their most famous collaboration? The 1976 remake of A Star is Born. Barbra starred, Peters produced, and together they created a cultural phenomenon. Peters once explained that when you love someone like Barbra, creativity comes naturally. It wasn't just love, it was synergy. They inspired each other, pushed each other, and sometimes nearly destroyed each other in the process. But Peters never stopped reminding the world of what first caught his attention. He spoke openly, even crudely, about his attraction to her. And yes, his obsession with her cute little round butt even made its way into the movie's script. When Chris Christopherson's character commented on Streisand's backside in the film, it wasn't just a line. It was Peter writing his infatuation into Hollywood history. For all the glitz surrounding them, their private life had its share of simple, almost shocking domesticity. One of the world's biggest stars and a scrappy hairdresser-turned-producer found themselves nesting in a modest ranch house. Barbara Walters, who interviewed them in the mid-70s, noted how small and unpretentious their home was. And for a while it worked. Walters once asked them if they thought they'd last 40 years. Peters confidently said yes, because nobody else would have us. Streisand, for her part, described them as equals, two strong personalities who clashed and connected in equal measure. Still, their dynamic was fiery. They bickered. They interrupted each other constantly in interviews, and Walters herself couldn't help but comment that it didn't look like they'd make it. She wasn't wrong. Their relationship was never static. They didn't just live in one house. They built 5 homes on their ranch. Each one reflected their stubborn streak. Instead of sharing a vision, they often built separately because they couldn't agree. It was passionate, competitive, and exhausting. And then came Yentl. Streisand was determined to make the film, and Peters didn't believe in it until she literally staged a performance at home, dressing in full costume to convince him. From that night forward, he supported her vision, but it was also the beginning of the end for them as lovers. Streisand poured her heart and soul into Yentl, leaving Peters feeling sidelined. By the early 1980s, they had been together for nearly 8 years, but both knew things had changed. Streisand later admitted that they had grown too dependent on one another, and dependency breeds resentment. She confessed that her passion for Yentl had eclipsed her relationship. It wasn't that they stopped caring, it was that they couldn't keep going the way they were. When they split, it wasn't with the bitterness you'd expect. Peters said they were better as friends, and Streisand agreed. Without the pressure of romance, they found respect again. They recognized each other's power and finally understood they couldn't control one another. Even decades later, Peters never stopped speaking about what she meant to him. He described her as the most captivating, creative person he'd ever met. He admitted that she had taught him about real women, about equality, and about power. For a man who started out thinking men should get their way 90% of the time, Streisand shifted his worldview, sometimes all the way to the opposite extreme. By 2017, Peters was still calling her the probable love of his life. He owed her, he said, for the life he had been able to build. And although they didn't end up celebrating that 40-year milestone as a couple, they did something almost as rare. They maintained a bond through friendship, shared history, and respect long after the passion burnt out. Don Johnson. If John Peters was the hustler who became her partner, then Don Johnson was the Hollywood heartthrob who swept Barbra Streisand into a whirlwind romance straight out of a magazine cover. He was lean, tan, and impossibly charming, with that famous grin that had already made him the star of Miami Vice. And when their paths crossed in Aspen during Christmas, sparks flew in a way even Streisand couldn't ignore. She admitted in her memoir, My Name is Barbra, that she had always been drawn to beautiful men, comparing them to works of art she liked to collect. Johnson fit that description perfectly. He made the first move, striking up a conversation, and she liked his confidence immediately. What followed was a relationship that she later described as fun, pure fun, a much-needed escape from the pressures of fame. Their early courtship had a playful energy. They went to Atlantic City to watch Mike Tyson fight, even though boxing was the last thing Streisand would have chosen for a date. She let herself get pulled into Johnson's world of boy things: football, helicopters, racing boats. She didn't always understand it, but she enjoyed the ride because with Don, life felt lighter. For a while, he made her happy in a simple, uncomplicated way. But like many whirlwind romances, the shine started to fade. The cracks showed when Johnson missed Streisand's birthday party while filming in Calgary. Instead of waiting, she flew to see him, but the visit only confirmed what she feared. Johnson seemed distant, distracted, taking phone calls in the car and not paying her the kind of attention she craved. Even when she tried to play him a demo of their duet, "Till I Loved You," he brushed it off. That song would become the breaking point. Streisand believed it was a beautiful collaboration, but Johnson saw it differently. Singing alongside her, the world's most celebrated voice, left him feeling exposed and insecure. Instead of talking it through, he turned cold, mistrustful, and angry. Streisand felt herself withdrawing in return. The final straw came with a phone call. When Streisand rang Johnson one day, his ex-wife, Melanie Griffith, answered. By then, Griffith was in rehab, and Johnson, who had conquered his own addictions, was trying to support her. Streisand didn't mind him being there for his ex. What she couldn't forgive was the lack of honesty. He hadn't told her the truth about where their relationship stood, and for Barbra, a man who couldn't be emotionally straight with her had no place in her life. That was it. The romance that had once been pure fun dissolved, leaving behind no bitterness, just clarity. Streisand walked away, knowing it wasn't meant to last. She had no regrets, though, because for a brief moment, Johnson brought joy and lightness into her world. Even now, decades later, there's still a trace of that connection. When they run into each other at parties, Johnson always pulls her into a hug and whispers, "I love you." Streisand never says it back, but the fact that he still feels it after all these years says enough. Then came Pierre Trudeau. Pierre Trudeau. Their first encounter wasn't just another Hollywood meet-cute. Trudeau and Streisand first crossed paths in January 1969 at a swanky gala in London. It was no ordinary night. It was the British premiere of Funny Girl, and both found themselves seated at Princess Margaret's table. Trudeau, Canada's newly minted Prime Minister, was already the talk of the town. The English press couldn't get enough of him. This wasn't the stiff, predictable image of a politician they were used to. Just days earlier, he had slid down a polished banister at Marlborough House while a mob of cameras flashed like lightning. Streisand, still reeling from her frozen marriage to Elliot Gould, had already taken note of Trudeau from afar. She'd spotted photos of the handsome single prime minister in Life magazine and joked to her best friend, Sis Corman, that he was exactly the kind of man she'd like to meet, and now, fate had handed her the chance. At Claridge's, Trudeau was everything she imagined and more. He asked her to dance, but she coyly declined, saying she didn't like doing so in public. Instead, she suggested he dance with Corman. The tabloids had a field day the next morning, splashing photos of Trudeau with his supposed new flame. In reality, Corman was a married mother of 4 and Streisand's longtime confidant. Back in New York, designer Arnold Agassi recalled the moment Trudeau first phoned Streisand. She was lounging in a bathrobe, hair wrapped in a towel, when her maid announced that the Prime Minister of Canada was on the line. Giggling, Barbra asked, "So, how did you get my number?" To Agassi, it was adorably naive. After all, he was the leader of a country. When she hung up, Streisand threw her hands in the air and quipped, "Just call me Madam Prime Minister." It was a joke, but the attraction was very real. On the surface, they seemed an unlikely pair. The quirky Jewish girl from Brooklyn and the Jesuit-educated, polished son of Montreal wealth. Yet both had risen to dizzying heights in the 1960s, their lives unfolding like parallel meteors destined to collide. By 1969, Trudeau was riding a wave of Trudeau-mania. Canadians had never seen anything like him. He was sexy, glamorous, and carried himself like a political rock star. Marshall McLuhan once described him as the perfect, cool figure for television, a medium that transformed him from professor to heartthrob overnight. Streisand's rise had been just as explosive. From Broadway triumphs in Funny Girl to her Grammy wins and Emmy-dominating TV specials, she had gone from an ugly duckling to one of the most recognizable faces in entertainment. It felt inevitable that their worlds would align. Their relationship grew through long-distance phone calls. In October 1969, Trudeau whisked down to New York to spend a weekend with her. They dined at Casa Brazil, hit an exclusive discotheque, and then disappeared into Streisand's apartment for the rest of the weekend. When a reporter later asked Trudeau how long he had known Streisand, he grinned and said, "Not long enough." Of course, Trudeau's aides couldn't ignore the political risk of him dating a married Hollywood superstar, but as one advisor put it, "We're debating whether Pierre should date the hottest star in the world. My God, this is political gold." Their romance wasn't just private, it was a spectacle. Streisand visited Ottawa, turning heads as she sat in Parliament in a paisley suit trimmed in sable. Even jaded politicians noticed Trudeau couldn't take his eyes off her. When she stood to leave, he signaled 5 more minutes like a lovesick teenager. Reporters breathlessly followed her every move, and she confessed the trip had been breathtaking. She even told a friend that being with Trudeau made her feel just like Jackie Kennedy. But there were cracks. Trudeau was serious about family and even floated the idea of marriage. Barbra admitted she fantasized about being Canada's First Lady. She pictured herself learning French, making movies only in Canada, and throwing herself into political causes. Yet reality pulled her back. Trudeau's Catholicism, her relentless Hollywood career, and her young son all weighed against the dream. She knew she could never ask him to give up his position, and so, with affection, they parted ways. Trudeau eventually married Margaret Sinclair, whose youth and spontaneity charmed Canadians, though their marriage would later unravel. Streisand moved on to Ryan O'Neal and others, but her affection for Pierre never truly faded. She sent him warm notes throughout his life and reached out after the tragic death of his son. When Trudeau died in 2000, she penned a tribute describing him as elegant, private, and dignified, a man who embodied that great connection of mind and body. Even decades later, Streisand couldn't resist talking about him. At a 2012 concert in Ottawa, she joked that Justin Trudeau reminded her of a nice Jewish boy from Brooklyn who simply went into his father's business. The audience chuckled knowingly. After all, Barbra had once come very close to being Canada's Madam Prime Minister. Their romance may have been brief, but it burnt brightly. And though life pulled them in different directions, Barbra Streisand and Pierre Trudeau remain one of those fascinating what-ifs of history. A love story that never fully happened, yet somehow never faded either. Andre Agassi. They say age is nothing but a number, and nowhere is that truer than in Hollywood. May-December romances are practically a rite of passage, but it's usually the men chasing youth. Barbra Streisand, though, she never played by the rules. In the 90s, she shocked everyone by stepping out with tennis golden boy Andre Agassi, who was, wait for it, 28 years younger.
Sometimes you feel like it's a matter of luck or a matter of destiny, but, Andre was always one of those players that...
The pairing made headlines everywhere, and Barbra didn't shy away from the spotlight. She was right there at his matches, cheering him on, while Agassi would casually gesture to her from the court. To the press, he brushed it off, calling their bond a very special friendship, and insisting she was a real good friend. Everyone else, of course, read between the lines. Years later, the truth came out. In his autobiography, Agassi admitted he was utterly fascinated by her. Not just the legend, not just the voice, but the woman herself. They laughed off the world's pearl-clutching over their age gap, and Agassi summed it up in one unforgettable line: "Dating Barbra Streisand is like wearing hot lava." Eventually, the flame cooled. He married Steffi Graf, and Barbra found lasting love with James Brolin, a romance that would become one of Hollywood's rare, long-lasting unions. James Brolin. The story of how they met is pure serendipity. Streisand revealed on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon in 2021 that she and Brolin were set up on a blind date back in 1996 at a dinner party. She confessed to being shy that night, slipping downstairs to play with the children before taking her seat at the table. Streisand's humor was on full display. She made a joke about Brolin's hair, fully expecting nothing to come of it. "I expected a guy with a brown beard and brown wavy hair like a mountain man. And I saw a guy that had all his hair cut off and no beard, and I walked by him. I put my hand through his hair and said, 'Hoof, et up your hair.'" Her quip might have been cheeky, but Brolin was intrigued. Despite her snark, they began dating. And what followed was a romance that would endure decades in an industry where love is often fleeting. During this period, Streisand was busy with her 1996 romantic comedy The Mirror Has Two Faces, which she directed and starred in. The film paired her with Jeff Bridges as her character's love interest, and Streisand lent her voice to the theme song, I Finally Found Someone. Brolin, ever the devoted partner, was by her side at the Oscars, where she was nominated for Best Original Song. He walked the red carpet with her, his gaze fixed on her with adoration. Their wedding was the stuff of legend, lavish, carefully orchestrated, and private. Streisand wore a Donna Karan gown walking down the aisle with her son Jason, while Brolin's son Josh served as best man. The guest list was Hollywood royalty: John Travolta, Tom Hanks and Rita Wilson, Quincy Jones, and countless others. Weeks later, they continued their public appearances, from the unveiling of Brolin's star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame to Streisand receiving the AFI Lifetime Achievement Award in 2001. Brolin stood at her side, watching with that same quiet pride, absorbing every moment of her triumph as if it were his own. Even their day-to-day life showed this rare, grounded connection. They appeared together at film premieres, Golden Globes, and Oscars, always a united front, a picture of love that refused to feel performative. From walking the red carpet for Brolin's 2003 comedy A Guy Thing to attending Streisand's Meet the Fockers premiere, the couple navigated Hollywood's constant scrutiny with grace and humor. In 2007, when Streisand was awarded the Légion d'honneur in France for her contributions to culture, Brolin was at her side. By July 2018, they had celebrated 20 years of marriage. In her 2023 memoir, My Name is Barbra, Streisand devoted an entire chapter to her life with Brolin. She reflected on the ambivalence she initially felt about settling down again. Jim and I met at a point in my life when I had basically given up on finding someone. And frankly, I was all right with being on my own. I had my son, I had great friends to keep me company, my work was fulfilling, and I loved my new house in Malibu overlooking the ocean, she wrote. Maybe you have to be happy with yourself before you can be happy with someone else. She also opened up about what drew her to Brolin, describing him as an intriguing mix of charm, confidence, and capability. I thought he was such an intriguing combination. Tall, great-looking, and if we were in a plane and something happened to the pilot, he could take over, she admitted. Jim was also a very good driver, from racing cars when he was younger. He was kind-hearted and sensitive, and he made me feel safe. Brolin, for his part, fell in love the very first night, according to Streisand. She recalls him saying, I fell in love with you the first night we met when you said, who fucked up your hair? I knew from that moment we would be together. That one cheeky comment, delivered with humor and a hint of defiance, started a partnership that would survive Hollywood's storms and create a model of longevity in a town where marriages rarely last. What are your thoughts on Barbra Streisand's love life? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.